Good evening. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature organization. I would like to welcome you to tonight's event in the 2020 Iowa City Book Festival. While we would love to be together in person for this year's fest, prudence dictates that we do otherwise. I thank those of you who are joining us live tonight via Crowdcast or watching later. Despite the challenges brought by our current situation, we will continue to work to connect writers and readers and to share and discuss ideas. Tonight, we welcome author Thomas Frank. I first became aware of Frank in the early 1990s when I came across his magazine, The Baffler. Many more people got to know him for his 2004 book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And later, for his books like Pity the Billionaire, The Wrecking Crew, and Listen Liberal. In addition to books, Frank has written for the Wall Street Journal and Harper's, among others, and writes regularly for The Guardian. His new book is The People Know. In it, Frank shows us that the conventional wisdom about populism is wrong, that we have forgotten about the movement that led to creation of the term, and that we in fact misuse it to describe the very things those early populists fought against. Normally our friends at Prairie Lights, who helped to organize tonight's event, would have a table outside the venue ready to sell you a copy of Frank's new book. Tonight we offer you the chance to buy the book virtually. If you click the Buy the Book/Support button at the bottom of your screen, it will take you directly to the book on the Prairie Lights page where you may purchase it. You also will learn about ways to support the City of Literature so that we can continue to offer free events like this one. Aiding in that work is the support we receive from the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, and Iowa Public Radio. Now, at any time during tonight's program, you can click the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen as well and submit a question. And after Thomas Frank makes a few introductory remarks, I will be leading a Q&A with him, and I will sprinkle your questions in amongst my own as we have time for. So now I would like to welcome Thomas Frank to the Iowa City Book Festival.
Well, hello there. How are y'all doing in Iowa City? It's me, Tom Frank, and I'm joining you from the UNESCO City of Graft and Misgovernment, Washington, D.C. This is our, okay, that's my joke. That's my opening, really funny line. Ha ha ha. I've written a new book. Actually, I guess the first thing I should say before I say anything else is how much I miss being there in person with you in Iowa City. And I think of all the fun things that I've done. I mean, what a wonderful town that is, and all the good times I have had in Iowa City, and the wonderful, wonderful audiences that I've discussed these books of mine with. Well, this new book, which, I assumed all along that I would be going around the country and promoting it in person, is called The People Know. A brief history of anti-populism. And it's about the history of, it's about populist movements in America, beginning with the very first one. And it's about the ways that our society has reacted to those movements. And what makes it especially topical right now is that we've been living through a period in which the word populism is both used all the time to describe these sort of really hateful movements. We use the word is used constantly in various academic disciplines and by, pundits here and there to describe what you might call racist authoritarianism, as it's used as a kind of synonym for racist demagoguery. It's like we apply the word to people like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro or the Le Pen family in France. But what the scholars and the pundits who contribute to this literature rarely ask is where the word came from. And when you ask that question and you look into it a little bit, it's actually absolutely a fascinating story. The word populism was consciously invented by some people. We know where it was invented. We know when it was invented, roughly. And we know what they meant when they invented it. And it's almost exactly the opposite of the way the word is used today. Now, since most of you are in Iowa City, you're in the state of Iowa, this history might be somewhat familiar to you. The original populists, the people who invented this word, were a left-wing third party that was powerful and, I should say, popular all across the Great Plains, all over the west of the United States, and all over the South in the 1890s. And in my home state of Kansas, where some guys invented the word out of thin air in the year 1891, populism actually managed to, well, there was a successful political movement and ran the state government for a number of years. By the way, the populist presidential candidate in 1892 was a man called James B. Weaver. He was a Civil War general from Iowa. Anyhow, the story of populism is absolutely fascinating. And I'll talk about the details of it later on if you guys want me to. I'm sure you will, because it's a really fun story. But what fascinated me, what came to fascinate me as I did the research for this book and as I wrote this book, was the reaction against populism, the backlash against this left-wing farmers movement on the Great Plains, this backlash against this movement that was mainly led by Eastern industrialists, newspapers, newspaper editors, academics, society preachers, and of course the Republican Party. And the terms in which they denounced populism are quite striking. You know, they said that this was a movement of hicks and rubes and hayseeds, people that didn't really understand modern economics, that didn't understand globalization, that were anti-intellectual, that were probably mentally ill, and they represented all the sort of pathologies that go with the lower ranks of society. And so you had this situation in the 1890s where the upper classes of America came together in a kind of hysterical frenzy and beat populism down. And what I do in the book is I trace the history of of populism in America, because it didn't just end with the death of the Populist Party, which fizzled out in about 1897, 1898. But the tradition itself continued on, and you see it coming up again in the 1930s, which is the great decade of the common man. And you also see the reaction against it. So in the 1930s, populism was sort of borne out by Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. You also had Iowa farmers go on strike, a very, very populist kind of move in that decade in the 1930s. You had the rise of the labor movement, tripled in size in the course of that decade. And you had a sort of culture that celebrated ordinary people, working class Americans. And again, the sort of upper classes of society in this country, and they were all pretty much together back then, they came together against Roosevelt in a phenomenal way, and again kicked up a kind of hysteria. And it was largely the same groups, the tycoons, millionaire class of the 1930s, aligned with newspaper publishers, high-powered academics, lawyers, that sort of thing, came together against Franklin Roosevelt, kicked up a kind of hysteria. And this time, instead of destroying the populist movement of the 1930s, the populists came out on top. Franklin Roosevelt won his election in a phenomenal landslide. Anyhow, that's the story. And you find these two sort of these two poles of American life, populism and anti-populism, recurring throughout our sort of national story. And we're in a very interesting time now where you have this incredible reaction against populism, everybody denouncing it, people using this term in the same way that they used it in the 1890s, in the same way they used it in the 1930s. But there is no real populist movement to speak of. Instead, they just use it as a general term of denunciation against the sort of lower orders in American life. And that's my introduction. I think it's pretty boring if I just read from the book. Although I have to say, folks, this is, in some ways, I think my most exciting book, even though it's about history. And the reason for that is that this is my first book ever that has color illustrations. And I would show them to you, but you can get a much better taste of what's in the illustrations if you go to my website, if you go to tcfrank.com. And there's a whole bunch of anti-populist illustrations from the 1890s that are quite hilarious. Anyhow, so let's open it up for questions. What do y'all have to say? John?
All right. Well, let's get going here. So we've got, I'll get us started. It looks like we'll get things populated here, but no pun intended. A big point in the book is that people label non-populist movements as populist. And you cite the example of people like Orson Welles, who back in his time, he was able to embrace the people and simultaneously attack demagogues, as you mentioned. And you said it was because Wells and others described demagogues with a term that was not populist, but rather fascist or pre-fascist.
Right.
And I was wondering why you think people have been so quick over the decades to label certain movements as populist and so shy, at least at certain times, in using the term fascist or even pre-fascist.
Well, I'd say we're in that situation now. Look, the word populist for 50, 60 years after the 1890s, the word only referred to this third party from Kansas, from the 1890s, and from Iowa, and from Minnesota, and the Dakotas, et cetera. That's what the word referred to, and it was spelled with an uppercase P, and that was the number one definition in American dictionaries. And the word really was not used in any way other than that. Or usages of it in a general sense would have been extremely uncommon. But beginning in the 1950s, you had a generation of intellectuals that decided, it began with a work of history that described the populist movement of the 1890s, a famous work of history by a guy called Richard Hofstadter. He was a historian at Columbia University in New York, and he really did not like populism very much. In fact, he despised it, and he went after the populists again and again and again in the course of his career, always accusing them of the same sort of things that they were accused of by the American elite of the 1890s. Populists were backward-looking people. They didn't understand modernity. They didn't understand modern economics. They were mentally ill. They were paranoid. They were in the grip of these other pathologies that pertain to people who were farmers, people who were going down. And then he added a couple of innovations of his own. He said that populism was anti-Semitic and that populism was xenophobic. Now, all of this was wrong. This is one of the most crushingly discredited sort of historical theses of all time, the Hofstadter interpretation of populism. It was crushingly refuted in the years that followed. What's funny, though, is that it being refuted didn't make any difference. Hofstadter had said when he wrote this about populism, he said we should use the word populism as a generic term for all movements of working class people that exhibit these pathologies. And basically, the larger idea was that all working class, all mass movements of ordinary people exhibit these. They're paranoid, they're xenophobic, they're anti-intellectual. They all have these same pathologies. Whenever you get a whole bunch of people together who have no business trying to run things, these terrible things will happen. And the word caught on, even though his history was bad, even though his understanding of the past was completely wrong. His reinterpretation of the word was immediately picked up by other intellectuals of that era of the 1950s, and is still in use today. There's a whole pedagogy today based on Hofstadter's misinterpretation of the 1890s. They call it global populism studies, and this is where the word as we use it today, this is where it came from. What made that big shift possible in the 1950s, I think, was there's long been a strain in American life of intellectuals and tycoons and affluent, rich people, basically, who don't like democracy. This goes all the way back to the founding of this country. I mean, the reason the founding fathers put an electoral college in the Constitution and the U.S. Senate was chosen by state legislatures, all these different things that they did was because they didn't trust democracy. Well, by the 1950s, you can't say that anymore. We just fought 2 world wars supposedly for democracy. We're fighting a Cold War for democracy. You can't say you don't like democracy anymore. So they have to come up with a different term to describe what it is that they don't like about democracy. And the word that they settle upon is populism. And they use this as a synonym, as I said before, as a synonym for racist demagogues. Now, look, racist demagogues are also as old as America. And the racist demagogues of the 1890s, as it happens, really hated populism. They tried to they did crush populism. And in the 1930s, when you had lots of these sort of demagogues running around, people like Orson Welles, I'm referring here to the movie Citizen Kane, had no trouble distinguishing between demagogues and the real deal, the real kind of honest populist movement, which they would have identified with organized labor. And we should be able to make that same distinction today. Unfortunately, it's become much, much, much more difficult for us. And I would say that is, by and large, by design. I mean, the way the word populism is used today by scholars and pundits alike is, and by the way, John, tell me when to be quiet, because I have a tendency to really blab if you don't stop me. But let me just finish the thought.
You're good.
the way the word populism is used by scholars and pundits alike, it carries with it this old meaning that you can't trust working class movements. And so people will say, because Donald Trump is a demagogue, therefore Bernie Sanders is also a demagogue. And therefore everybody who is not part of our little centrist collective here in Washington, D.C. is equally equally demagogic and equally, loathsome, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So populism is a word that they can use to describe the people that they want to keep out of the conversation, whether those people are legit or not. I should mention, by the way, in case somebody wants to ask about this later, Citizen Kane is Donald Trump's favorite movie.
Yeah, I noticed you had mentioned that in the book when you were talking about Wells. Yes. So we have an interesting question that kind of gets at the roots of populism and the People's Party. The questioner asked, did you intentionally fail to mention Nebraska when discussing where populism took hold? Wasn't William Jennings Bryan a presidential candidate nominated by the Populist Party? I'm used to Iowans being unable to utter the word Nebraska, but I'm surprised by a Kansan falling prey to the same failing. So get a little statism there.
I'm sorry I left out a lot of states where populism was big. Did you know they elected at one point the mayor of San Francisco was a populist? But yeah, populism was strong in Nebraska. It was also strong in North Carolina, which I usually do talk about, and hopefully someone will ask about that. But let me tell the story briefly about William Jennings Bryan, because he's a really interesting figure. And what happened was, in the 1890s, the Populist Party was growing by leaps and bounds. It looked at first as though they were going to, they had a great future ahead of them. The decade of the 1890s, the economy went into a tailspin. The country went into a terrible depression. And here's the Populist Party, which is the first modern party of the left in America. And it looks like they're going to be able to take advantage of the situation. You've got huge strikes going on in America. The Pullman strike up in Chicago. You have the first ever March on Washington, led by a populist, a guy. It was called Coxey's Army. They were an army of the unemployed, marched on Washington, and it looks like populism is the coming thing. And then something really crazy happens. In 1896, it's a presidential election, big political year, and the Democratic Party meets for their convention in Chicago, Illinois. And the first thing they do is they make it clear that they're not going to renominate the sitting president of the United States, who was a Democrat, Grover Cleveland, a very conservative Democrat. And next thing they did is they denounced the gold standard. The populists, by the way, their issues were to monetary reform. They wanted to nationalize or regulate the railroads. They wanted farmers programs. And then they wanted a bunch of electoral reforms like votes for women, make it easier to vote, a secret ballot, that kind of thing. They wanted to do away with lobbying, among other things. Anyhow, but monetary reform was very important to them. That's basically shorthand for getting America off the gold standard. And if you're really interested, I can explain why. But they were way ahead of their time on this, getting us off the gold standard. But anyhow, the Democratic Convention, or the Democratic Party, meets for their convention in 1896. They denounce the gold standard. And then the next thing they do is they nominate this guy from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan, 36 years old, a one-term congressman. And they nominate this guy for the presidency on the grounds of his, on the basis of a fantastic speech that he has just given denouncing the gold standard. This is the famous Cross of Gold speech. You know, you shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, meaning the gold standard. And it's Bryan is the man of the moment. He appears to be a man of destiny, this exciting political figure with this incredible oratorical ability. The Populist Party meets for their convention a short time later, and a lot of them, because Bryan is from Nebraska, a lot of the leaders of the Populist Party they know him personally. And one of Bryan's attributes is that he talks like a populist. He uses a lot of the same kind of language that the Populist Party uses. And so they say, well, let's go ahead and endorse him for president. Let's make him the nominee of the Populist Party also. They said they acknowledged that he was not with them on their other issues. The Populists had a whole bunch of reform issues, and Bryan was not with them on a lot of those other issues, but he was with them on the one big issue of the day, the currency, the issue of monetary reform. And so they went ahead, and it was a huge compromise. They fought and fought and fought about it, but they finally decided, let's go ahead and endorse William Jennings Bryan, because if he wins, and everybody thought he was going to win at first, if he wins, then we, the Populist Party, will be able to name seats in his cabinet, or we'll have some say in Washington. So they took this gamble. Okay. And gamble didn't pan out. Bryan never did make it to the White House. He never did win. But what's absolutely fascinating about William Jennings Bryan's campaign for the presidency in 1896 is the way the elites of this country came together against him. It's quite extraordinary. They convinced themselves that Bryan represented a kind of spirit of the French Revolution, that he represented class warfare, that he represented all those attributes that I described earlier. The New York Times said he was mentally ill, that he was in the grip of paranoia. The other sort of the Republicans mounted this incredible campaign against him, spreading pamphlets all over the country, sending speakers around to shadow Bryan as he traveled from city to city. And they said he was, he advocated mob rule, or he represented mob rule. He represented rule by the least capable elements of society, meaning farmers, meaning workers, meaning people at the bottom. And that he was had this foolish faith in the common man, as they used to say back in those days. And the word that this campaign against Bryanism, they came up with a single word to describe everything that they thought was wrong with William Jennings Bryan, and the word they used was populism. And again, you can see some of these cartoons from the 1890s where they're always denouncing Bryan in the most extreme terms as this kind of satanic figure. There's one of them that shows him as an Italian immigrant who's just assassinated Lady Liberty. It's quite insane. Anyhow, they outraised and outspent poor old William Jennings Bryan. They outraised and outspent him either 20 to 1 or 30 to 1. We don't really know, because the parties didn't have to reveal how much they raised and spent in presidential elections back then. But the Republicans were able to raise an extraordinary war chest, probably the most ever spent by a political party on a presidential election if you measure it in terms of GDP. And Bryan had nothing. He traveled around the country, carried his own suitcases. He would travel on what were called day coaches, just riding around the country, giving speeches, and they crushed him. John, I see you over there in the corner. What are you?
Oh, I'm not trying to give you
No, I talk too much.
Note there.
It's important. It's important to stop me from time to time, or I will just blab.
Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to talk about.
By the way, speaking of Bryan, not many people are interested in Bryan anymore. Here's his campaign memoirs from that campaign from 1896, the first battle. He already knew that there was going to be a second one and a third one.
Look at all the Post-its in that. That's a well-read book you have there, Tom.
Yes. Well, that's my 1896. That election is something of an obsession for me. You know who else it's an obsession for? That's right, Karl Rove.
Interesting. I would imagine he has a slightly different take on things than you do.
Yeah, that's right. He's over on the other side of Washington. By the way, I'm in Bethesda. Donald Trump was hospitalized not very far from where I'm sitting right now. We were driving. Went to the grocery store the other day, and we drove right by there, the Bethesda Naval Hospital where he was. And there's all these media people and people waving flags and stuff out in front. It's crazy.
So you didn't go line the streets for his drive-by?
I didn't. I didn't know he was going to do that. I did want to ride my bike over there and look at all the media. They were all spread out on the sidewalk out in front of the Bethesda Naval Hospital. Anyhow.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit, so much of your book deals with protecting the elites, that anti-populism is largely about protecting the position of the elites versus the masses. And it seems like today we have the left is ignoring the elites that are business interests and economists somewhat, and on the right they're ignoring academics and scientists, perhaps even more so. I was just wondering about that dichotomy where you have two ends of the political spectrum, both they have their own experts or their elites that they pledge allegiance to and kind of dismiss what's coming from the other side, and how that might fit into the evolution of populism and anti-populism.
Yeah. Well, today we've got lots of anti-populism. I mean, there's a whole literature. There's, as I mentioned, there's a whole academic discipline, a whole pedagogy that's that has enshrined anti-populism as its purpose. We have lots of anti-populism. We don't have the real deal to speak of, not much anyways. I mean, you have people like Bernie Sanders, who certainly comes out of the populist tradition and certainly understands that, but we don't have a populist party anymore. Let's put it that way. And what you've seen happen, and this is, by the way, this is the subject of my lifetime. This is what I've now written 5 books about, is that the Republican Party has been captured by and really answers to a certain elite, as we all know, a business elite. People like it's almost a cartoon at this point. The Koch brothers, this sort of billionaire class. But what's much more interesting to me is that the Democratic Party, which was traditionally since the days of Bryan, was the more populist of the two parties and really represented that tradition of, they called themselves the party of the people, and they represented the tradition of working class democracy. I mean, that's who they were. When I was born, the Democratic Party everyone knew that they were aligned with organized labor and with family farmers to some degree. And that has almost completely disappeared. And what you find that the Democratic Party identifying themselves with nowadays is your sort of enlightened white collar professional class. So the Republicans have like the upper 0.1% of the income distribution, and the Democrats have the top 10% of the income distribution. And you're in this situation now where they both answer to elites. They both answer to different elite social groups. And people who still believe in the old, populist formula, working class people from all different racial and ethnic backgrounds coming together for economic democracy, right? That's what populism was, and that's what that's what the populist tradition has always been. Those people don't really have anywhere to go anymore, and this is I find this absolutely fascinating. I keep bringing it back to where I'm sitting right now, Bethesda, Maryland. And Bethesda, Maryland is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. It's this very affluent, white-collar suburb of Washington, very highly educated. The neighborhood that I'm in right now, more than 50% of the adults here have PhDs. It's not because we're near a university or anything. They just happen to have them. That's just the kind of neighborhood that it is. And it is, needless to say, extremely democratic, extremely liberal on the social issues. However, there is very, very little sympathy in a place like this for labor, for issues that have to do with the workplace, that have to do with minimum wage, that have to do with your power vis-a-vis the boss. They're just not interested in that. I'll give you an example of what I mean. There's these yard signs that are very popular around here. This is, by the way, they're mansionizing Bethesda. It's I don't know if this happens. Of course, it happens in Iowa City, where they wreck down old buildings and fill them in with these enormous houses that go right up to the edge of the property line. And I ride around on my bike and look at these and take pictures of them. Sometimes they fascinate me. And you never see Trump signs in front of these places, but you do see these other. I haven't seen a single Trump sign in this part of Bethesda, but you do see these yard signs that try to list all the liberal causes. They're trying to be very, very, very broad-minded, and they say, Black Lives Matter, and women's rights are human rights, and science is real, and it's something about water. They want clean water or something. I forget. I mean, all things that I agree with, right? But what always strikes me about these signs is that there's something very conspicuously left out. And that is labor. It is work. It is, wages. It is, being able to afford healthcare, being able to, live your life without having to go into debt. Being, that people who didn't go to fancy universities can lead a middle-class life. That's not even part of the consciousness for these people anymore. And that's liberalism. And that's where we are. That is American liberalism now. And it squares off against this kind of awful demagogic Trumpist conservatism, which does make appeals to working class voters. These completely screwed up culture war, appeals. About movie stars looking down on you, and athletes disrespecting the flag, and oh my God, the fake news. On and on and on. What I've been writing about for years, and that's our politics now. And it is, for someone like me, it is massively frustrating. But there's no populism in it. All right, John, I'm shutting up. You asked a simple question, and I just couldn't stop talking.
I found a pretty good tool there, though, but I'm trying to sense when you're winding down, so that's good.
Yeah.
One thing I didn't see in the book, and I will admit I have not made it to the end yet, but I've read an awful big chunk, and I don't see any mention of campaign finance in there, and I'm wondering if you've given thought to that, or maybe I've just missed it in the book. Is there a role that campaign finance plays in all of this, in that the parties are going after those big money donations and the dark money, and obviously then aligning with the interests of the entities that can fund the campaigns in a way that they couldn't win otherwise? I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I refer to it in passing. The thing is, not every book is on every subject, and I've written about that before at great length. And it's just, the thing is that I've written all of these books about politics, and I'm so tired of so much of it. For example, what's the matter with Kansas about the sort of white working class shifting over to the Republican Party? And this was highly controversial back when that came out in 2004, and I had to really fight to get that message out there. And now everybody talks about this, and I'm sick of it, because I spent 10 years talking about it. But I of course I refer to these things in passing, but I like to look at that subject in a slightly larger way. I mean, obviously that is true, and the fact that it's essentially campaign donations. We're basically back to the McKinley, to this election. 1896, William McKinley. He was raising these incredible amounts of money. There was absolutely no requirements for him to. He didn't have to account for it in any way. One of the funny stories. And I will get back to your question because I do have an answer for it, but now I'm going to tell you an anecdote because I live to tell anecdotes. I mean, that's really what it's all about. So McKinley didn't really do anything in 1896. He ran what they called a front porch campaign. It's very similar to what Joe Biden is doing right now, the basement campaign. But McKinley sat on his porch in Ohio, and on a rocking chair, and people came to visit him. He didn't go anywhere. He just sat at his house. And the guy who was really dynamic, the sort of generalissimo of the Republican campaign this year, was this tycoon by the name of Mark Hanna. He was a Cleveland millionaire. I forget where he got his money, but he was something of a political genius. Now, this was a time of incredible corruption in American politics. So by the way, what we find as you go through history, these things always go together. Extreme inequality and political corruption are always, hand in hand. So you have all these monopolies. You have the very wealthy in American life who are intermarrying with European aristocracy. You have the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies, whatever, and at the same time, you have incredible corruption. So the railroads were able to dominate. I don't know about Iowa, but in Kansas, certainly the Santa Fe Railroad was able to basically dominate, what the state legislature did. And this happened all over America. State legislatures would always be answering to whatever the powerful economic interests in the state were, often railroads. Anyhow, Mark Hanna comes along, and he's the great sort of Republican genius of that era. And he says, look, the Democrats have nominated this guy, William Jennings Bryan, and he is preaching class war. And we've got to come together. And there's this great fear in American life back then of class war. Everybody thought it was just around the corner. The Pullman strike was a taste of it. The Homestead strike outside of Pittsburgh was a taste of it. And people assumed by and large that it was coming. And so Mark Hanna, the Republican manager, goes to the headquarters of the great American corporations, all of them in Manhattan. And he actually goes door to door, and he says, I am the representative of the Republican presidential candidate. Open the books. And they did. They would open the books, and he would say, okay, as the representative of the Republican Party, I'm here to tell you that we are facing the class war. We are facing populism. We are facing this uprising of the lower orders, and it's an incredibly dangerous situation, and you have to fund us. And then he would actually look at what their profits were for the preceding year and demand a percentage of their profits. Basically, this is a private sector tax being levied by the Republican Party. And what's astonishing is that the corporations paid it. They actually wrote him a check for whatever amount it was that he demanded. This is all in a famous book by a historian called Matthew Josephson that was written back in the 1930s. And the Republican Party, with this incredible war chest, was able to fund the most, extraordinary campaign of, absolutely dominating the polling all over America, with using every sort of trick known to the 19th century mind. And we're able to eventually to crush William Jennings Bryan, who, as I said, when all of this began and he gave this amazing speech at the Democratic Convention, everyone assumed that Bryan was the great coming force in politics and that he would certainly be elected president, but he was not. He never was. Anyhow, so to fast forward to the present, we're in a very similar situation today. Look, monopoly is basically unregulated in America now. We have the laws are on the books. They have been since the 1890s. We just don't use them. The Silicon Valley is very open about their ambitions for monopolistic control in a way that no corporation. I mean, they're dreaming of of a kind of monopoly power that no other corporation has ever been able to dream of. And our government doesn't do anything about it. Donald Trump doesn't do anything about it. I mean, he threatens here and there. He does nothing about it. And Barack Obama before him did nothing about it. Worse than that, Barack Obama brought these people into the White House. Do you remember his sort of events with Mark Zuckerberg and how Eric Schmidt was on his, one of his closest advisors? And towards the end of the Obama administration, the White House was filled with all these guys from Google. They'd all relocated from California. It's like we do the opposite. Monopoly is out of control. Economic inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality are out of control. We can't really measure what they were like in the 1890s because there was no income tax. But by all the measurements that were available to them back then, it's much worse today. We have passed the Gilded Age, and political corruption is back with it, and in ingenious ways. The same as Mark Hanna, unleashing this great campaign of 1896 against the reformer Bryan. That's we see the same thing today. The only way in which it's sort of marginally different, I would say in a very interesting way, is that the Democrats now routinely outraise the Republicans. Hillary outraised the billionaire Donald Trump 2-1, outraised and outspent, which is extraordinary. She also carried the wealthiest suburbs in America, even flipping things like Orange County, California, which had always been a famous Republican fortress. She carried that. And I think you're going to see the same with Biden. He's going to outraise and outspend the billionaire again, even though Trump is the incumbent. I mean, we aren't there yet, but we're in a very unusual situation, but basically the parameters are the same. The only thing that's interesting, or the difference that's really extraordinary, is that both parties now represent different wings of the American upper class. The Democrats represent the meritocracy, the meritocratic elite, the ones who went to fancy colleges and work in highly educated fields like finance, Wall Street, big pharma, high tech. And the Republicans represent this other wing of the elite, people who inherited their money or people who are entrepreneurs or something like that, and who work in, say, oil, who own companies like that. That's that's the difference. It's actually kind of a big difference, but okay, that's enough. I should stop talking. God, I took up 10 whole minutes there. Nobody's going to get to ask their question. I'm so sorry, folks.
That's all right. Well, we do have a question from the audience. It says, I've enjoyed and learned from your work since 2004, especially back when you were a leftist columnist on the Wall Street Journal opinion page.
Yeah, those were the days, yeah.
Yeah, it says, I'm curious how that experience working with a conservative-leaning newspaper sharpened the critique you offered in Listen Liberal and now in The People Know.
Well, I hadn't really come up with it at the time. So when I worked for the Wall Street Journal, this was I started in 2008. I only was there for about 2 years. And I should say right off the bat that they were great to work with. They were very, very professional. My editor there was fantastic. The copy editor there was fantastic. Now we had some hilarious conversations because everybody else there was very conservative. But what they thought I was kind of amusing. And I think they liked what I had to say. They were very interested that I wrote about organized labor because they wrote about it too, but they didn't really understand it in the way that I did. They had their own take on it, and they were fascinated by what I would say about it. They were also fascinated by what I would say about the Obama administration. And but at the time, I was so the thing that was really interesting about my period at the Wall Street Journal is that that's when the financial crisis happened. I was there when the financial crisis, went down in 2008 and 2009. And so I was trying to write about this in real time as it was happening. And it was absolutely fascinating. And it's an experience that I'll never forget. I remember to this day where I was, when all these different things happened. But I remember trying to figure out what a credit default swap was. Nobody knew. And I was calling all of these experts. I'm like, I'm a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. I got to be able to comment on this. And I was phoning all these people. Nobody knew what a credit default swap was. This is when AIG was going down. And do you remember what else about that time? Glenn Beck was riding high back then, and he was really stoking the sense of panic abroad in the country. By the way, which the right has always been very, very good at. If you watched the Republican convention just a few weeks ago, they're extremely good at pushing people's panic buttons. But I remember how Glenn Beck was doing that. And then you had the rise of the Tea Party movement. And one of my claims to fame as a Wall Street Journal columnist is that I actually went to the very first Tea Party gathering. I had put out sort of word that I thought, look, we're going into another Great Depression, as the viewers of this event know. I'm a big fan of literature from the 1930s. And so I was saying to myself, we're going into another Great Depression. You're going to start to see protests. You're going to start to see strikes. You're going to see all kinds of interesting things. And I put out sort of word to my friends that, I want to know about it if anybody hears about anything like this. And the first answer I got was someone said, you should see this. And it was the guys planning. It was like a few days after Rick Santelli's famous rant on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade. And they were planning a Tea Party rally in Lafayette Park in front of the White House. And so I went there. And they all were filming each other. This is sort of the beginnings of this, when everybody had their iPhone or their little camera, and they were all filming each other. All the protesters were filming each other. And if you go back and look at that footage of that very first protest, I'm there with my tweed jacket and my little notepad writing it all down. It was, and I made fun of it in the newspaper the next day. I was like, what a joke this is. This is so ridiculous. Of course, I thought it was ridiculous because it was populism turned upside down. It was a pseudo-populist movement that was launched from the board of the Chicago Board of the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade among a bunch of commodity traders. These are the people that, in the sort of populist hierarchy of evil, in the populists from the 1890s, these were the worst guys on the planet. The commodity brokers in Chicago. And this is who launches this protest movement. Oh my God. It was such a hoot. Anyhow, those were great times. I loved doing that.
Great. Well, that gets back to a question that I wanted to ask. It seems like the right is much better able to rally the troops into this monolithic force. You talk about the beginnings of the Tea Party when it was just these folks that are the furthest you could imagine from populists that are there.
Yeah.
And yet,
then it caught on. That was the big surprise. I made fun of it, and then it caught on.
Yeah, but I was wondering what your thoughts are about that, how things like that seem to catch on and have much more currency on the right than they do on the left. The left is much more fractured. People seem to be in very disparate camps. Does that have anything to do with the fact that populism continues to kind of fall behind anti-populism?
Well, there's this old saying about the difference between the two political parties. Democrats are famously disorganized, but Republicans always, as the saying goes, Republicans always get in line. At the end of the day, they stop fighting and they get behind the candidate. And you look at someone like Ted Cruz, who, I was there at the Republican convention in 2016 when Ted Cruz got booed off the stage. I've never seen anything like that. It was incredible. And now he's like one of Donald Trump's biggest supporters. He was personally humiliated by Trump in a shocking way. And now he's on board. And the same with Rand Paul. But this is typical for the Republican Party. And Democrats have always been much more disorganized. Although, look, one of my sort of larger theories about American politics is that the two parties are in some important ways flipping positions. And you look at something like Orange County going from red to blue, or I'm from Johnson County, Kansas. The same thing is happening there. It's happening in these affluent counties all over America. They're slowly flipping from Republican to Democratic. And you now see this disciplined you see this sort of disciplined nature of in the Democratic Party. This, for example, when all the different candidates dropped out in a single day after being asked to by former President Barack Obama in order to endorse Joe Biden and thus stop Bernie Sanders. Well, I've never seen Democrats do that sort of thing. They never do that. They, their Democrats are always fighting like cats and dogs, but this time they did it. And that's kind of extraordinary. And that shows real discipline. And like I said, they're also probably going to outraise Trump this year, and so on. There's all these different interesting ways in which the two parties are flipping.
So what's the future for populism? We obviously feel like we kind of had a move toward that with Bernie Sanders, and obviously you just talked about what happened to that latest iteration of that move. Is there a future for populism? Is there a time where the masses can do what you certainly would like to have them do?
I sure hope there is, because there's got to be a future. Because look, one of the historical arguments that I weigh in on in this book, and I do hope that you buy it and read it, because I'm here to tell you I'm very proud of it. It's pretty good. It's good stuff. But one of the arguments that I weigh in on is this argument from the 1950s that Richard Hofstadter and his friends made back then, which is their argument was that the way you get reform in America is by bringing together a whole bunch of highly educated people, in Washington, D.C., the leaders of all these the lobbyists for all of these different interests, the leaders of all these different interest groups, and you get them around a big table in Washington and they hammer everything out. And that's how you get good government. That's how you get reform. That's how you manage the economy. That's how you win the Cold War against communism. You put experts in charge, and you don't listen to ordinary people. You keep them out of it. You find ways to shut them out. And this is his whole attack on populism. His book is called The Age of Reform, and the idea being that mass movements of working class people are not how you get reform. That mass movements of working class people are extremely dangerous, and they lead to authoritarianism, and they lead to McCarthyism, and they lead to fascism. And so you don't want mass movements of working class people. That was Hofstadter's take. And that was that whole consensus generation of intellectuals. And I would say that's the Democratic Party's take today. I mean, that was certainly the guiding ideal of the Obama administration. And I expect it'll be the guiding ideal of the Biden administration, should we be so fortunate. But I'm here to tell you that the opposite is closer to the truth. That the only time we've seen what happens when you have government by these highly educated elites in Washington, and that is all the reforms are half measures. Obamacare, the Dodd-Frank thing, the Obama stimulus. I mean, Trump got a bigger stimulus than Obama did, and Obama's supposed to be the liberal one, right? But he couldn't break up the banks. He had to bail them out. He couldn't even, he couldn't prosecute any of these Wall Street executives who had so obviously committed fraud. I mean, the most brazen kind of fraud. And he couldn't even fire them. So this is what happens when you get government by, this sort of professional elite, is they behave in a very self-serving way. And my argument is exactly the opposite of Hofstadter's. What you have to have, if you really want economic democracy in this country, if you really want democratic economic reform, what you have to have is a mass movement of working class people, a mass movement. And it's not just populism, and it's not just the New Deal. This is something that Martin Luther King and a lot of other guys in the 1960s talked about and wrote about. Towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King was trying to transition the civil rights movement, which was sort of one of the last great, mass movements of ordinary people, was trying to transition that movement into an economic movement that would demand, economic democracy, what he called the freedom budget or the economic bill of rights. Unfortunately, he was murdered before he got very far with that campaign. But that's so obviously what is missing in American life. I mean, in the intervening years, he died in 1968. And in the intervening years, we've seen organized labor been beaten down by the Republicans and given the cold shoulder by the Democrats. I mean, movements of farmers, the family farmers are, as you're in Iowa, this, family farmers have been largely destroyed, wiped out. They don't, even though, well, and then he just stopped talking. But look, this is what you have to have. This is what you have to have if you want a proper social democracy in this country, is a populist movement along those lines from the 1890s or the 30s or the 1960s. And I think that is, I hope that is becoming more and more obvious to people as we go along. We can't just go back and forth between having government by the sort of white collar class and then government by these kind of, thuggish right wingers. This can't go on.
All right, we've got one comment here that it's a question for you. Maybe we can end on this one, and this might take a moment. It says, I've long thought that the U.S. needs a real socialist party so that working class people do not need to submit to being represented by the Clintons or Biden each time. Would you agree?
Oh, hell yes. But this is, that's populism. That's what it was. It was, they didn't call themselves socialists. They like to trace their ancestry to, or their thinking to Thomas Jefferson rather than to Karl Marx. But they were basically, by European standards, they were a social democratic party. They came up at the same time as the Labour Party in England. They had a lot in common with the Labour Party in England and in Australia. And when populism died after that disastrous election in 1896, a whole lot of their leadership went over to the brand new Socialist Party. That was led by Eugene Debs, who was a populist at one time. And the main socialist newspaper in America was published in Kansas, by the way, in a little town in Kansas, Girard, Kansas. It was called the Appeal to Reason, and it had an enormous circulation. But it had started life as a populist newspaper. And so I think that, yes, absolutely, we need a third party. But there's this huge problem in America, which is that after populism died, all of these different states around America took these different measures to make sure that populism never happened again, that you never had a third party. You would never have another third party movement that would challenge the two main parties in this way. And populism was not just a single guy running for president like Ross Perot or something like that. This was, they had senators, they had mayors, they had members of Congress, they had governors, the whole thing. They were contesting every office all over the country. And in some places they were, bigger than one of the two major parties. In a lot of places they won outright. Anyhow, the two main parties wanted to make sure that this would never happen again. And they made illegal one of the basic strategies of third-party movements in the 19th century, which was a strategy called fusion, where the third party would get together with one of the two major parties in an election in order to overwhelm the other main party. And the populists used this to great effect in different states. So in Kansas, they would fuse with the Democrats. In North Carolina, they would fuse with the Republicans. And in this way, overcome whoever was the dominant party in that state. Well, that's against the law now. You can't do that. And there's no good reason for that. There's no good constitutional reason. It's just against the law. And it's not a surprise, given that, and then given a couple of other things, that you never see successful third-party movements anymore. So you have to challenge the two major parties from within, is my feeling. I would love to see third parties come back again because they had an important role in democracy in the 19th century. The Republican Party was a third party at one time. And third parties had, an important role. They would force the two parties to address some question that they were ignoring. But it's very, very difficult today. So you have to work within the two major parties. I'm going to end on a hopeful note, and it's going to be a very ironic hopeful note, because Donald Trump, who I do not consider a populist, and who at great length in the book I describe why he's not a populist. I'll give you one reason. He just nominated a woman to the Federal Reserve Board who wants to put us back on the gold standard. But Donald Trump showed us that it is possible to work within one of the two existing parties and completely destroy the ruling sort of elite within that party. Just think about what he did to Jeb Bush. Do you remember this back in 2016? And you also look at Bernie Sanders, who got much farther than anybody, including myself, much farther than anybody thought he would get. much farther than his friend Ralph Nader got. And so it is possible. It is possible to build a new organization within the sort of the shell of the old. And I think that's the way to go right now. But that's just strictly tactical. The larger strategic thing to do is to read this book, folks. Okay? All right. 9 o'clock here in Washington.
All right. Well, I think we will end on that note. I appreciate your time tonight, Tom Frank. Thank you very much for joining us. I will remind those watching now that you still have a moment. You could click buy the book, and you can buy Tom's book, The People Know, or I'm sure any of his other books from our friends at Prairie Lights. And you can also visit them online at prairielightsbooks.com and buy that if you are so moved after the event. We have
come on,
events.
Of course they are. And I just want to say, it's Prairie Lights. What a great institution that is. And these bookstores like this have to survive. If you want to hang on to your democracy, folks, and your ability to get information from more than just one source, we have to have institutions like Prairie Lights. We
would agree. And we have events going on the rest of this week and into next week, so you can check those out at iowicitybookfestival.org. In the meantime, thank you again to everyone who tuned in tonight, and thank you again to Thomas Frank. And this has been day 2 of the Iowa City Book Festival. So thanks and have a good night.
All right, we'll see you later.
Thank you.
All right.